Welcome to today's webinar on international student recruitment in times of global crisis, new strategies, innovations, and risk mitigation for business schools. Today's webinar is co-sponsored by the Global Business School Network, XOLAS, and Studyportals. Before I introduce today's panelists, I wanted to go over some logistical information. As webinar participants, you will be muted throughout the duration of the webinar. Please submit any questions or comments at any point of the webinar through your Q&A function on your toolbar. Simply click the Q&A button on your toolbar to pop up the box and submit your question at any moment. The moderator will be able to monitor questions and include them in the discussion throughout the duration of today's webinar. Today's webinar is moderated by Matthias Falkenstein, who is the founding partner of XOLAS. Our panel includes speakers: Andrew Jack, who is the Global Education Editor of the Financial Times; Thijs van Voet, who is the Director of Analytics and Consulting at Studyportals; and finally, Sanjeev Kagram, who is the Dean of Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University. Welcome to our panel. Matthias, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Nicole, and a great welcome. Hello, good morning, good afternoon to everyone who is joining into this webinar. We are very happy to have such a large group of business school and university academics and administrators in this call. We have a registration for over 330 participants. I'm very happy to have such a large group in this call here today. It's also a great pleasure and honor to moderate this for me. As Nicole said, I'm a founder of XOLAS, and I'm very happy to have Andrew here from the Financial Times, as well as Thijs from Studyportals, and Sanjeev, the Dean of Thunderbird School of Global Management. We will talk today around a major challenge that all business schools are facing right now. Business schools have received the lockdown as anyone else in the higher education scene. However, we know that the rapid economic downturn will have a huge impact on business schools in particular, because business schools are seen as a major force in internationalization. They rely largely on international student mobility, faculty mobility. And so the current lockdown will create the challenge to the schools most heavily. We know from others that currently over 43% of the MBA students, for example, at Wharton, demand the schools to lower the tuition fees. We know this also from other schools, and we see a very strong pessimism at business schools currently when it comes to the next intake for 2020 and 2021. I would ask Thijs van Voet to come in here with some data that will let us understand better what are the current trends in management education and in business schools, and particularly in student recruitment. Thank you, Thijs.
And thank you, Matthias. Can everybody see my screen? At least the panelists can let me know whether it's visible. I think it is. I would just like to take you through a couple of trends, let's say, some insights that we have at Studyportals, based on actually three things, if you like. One is a survey we did recently amongst by now just under 1,400 respondents, asking them worldwide, asking them basically how the coronavirus is impacting their study abroad plans. The second source is research into what the universities that we work with, and Studyportals works basically with well over 3,000 universities, how they are adapting to Corona and this current pandemic in terms of changing application deadlines, providing extra services to students on counseling, lowering of tuition fees, what have you. And thirdly, the data that we have and the interest we see changing because of COVID, I guess, for certain types of programs. So are master's programs more or less popular? Are short courses more or less popular, etc.? Just quickly, let me show you a couple of slides. What we see in the survey is basically that by and large, about 65% of students is actually not intending to change their study plans. So that overall is quite a good thing. But it also means that about, let's say 30 to 40% or 35% is going to change. And we do see changes between the students that intend to start within the next 6 months. So let's say when we did the survey, when we started, that was really looking at the September intake, and students that intend to enroll later. And then of the students that intend to enroll for the fall intake, we see that 39% is thinking of postponing to next year, and 54% is considering to enroll online, with 14% thinking of going to a different country and 24% staying in their home country. Now, it's really funny because just an hour before this webinar, I got some new results in, and we see that more students are inclined to start to do an online course now compared to early in March, April, when we started the survey, and more students are intending to stay at home. So that's something to watch out for. Similarly, if we look at where are those students currently, the ones that are still at home versus the ones that are already studying abroad, let's say, again, we see some differences in terms of their plans to maybe defer till next year, or their plans about enrolling online with, for instance, those who are still at home. Of course, logically, in larger shares, thinking about postponing until next year compared to the ones that are already abroad. I'm not going to go into this too much. Slides will be made available later on. Then, is there a difference between bachelor and master students? Quite a bit. Students that are looking to do a master program, so are currently doing a bachelor's, looking for a master's, let's say, 34% is thinking about enrolling next year, 54% is thinking about enrolling online, versus 43 and 45% respectively. So there are already some differences. At the same time, it doesn't all look too worrying yet, but the reality, of course, is with the students that say they are not intending to change their plans, not even for the September intake, big question is, even if they get admitted, will they get a visa? Will they be able to travel? And if not, what is the financial implication for business schools or universities at large, let's say, because that can really be a major cut in students. I know from research in the UK that universities are expecting a cut in international students up to 75%. So that is very serious. What are universities doing? The research that we have done shows that out of 1,500 universities, 1,300 universities, 1,224 are teaching online, 153 have changed their start date, 231 the application date, and 108 have actually decided to change their tuition fee, and that actually means change their tuition fee by lowering it, which I suppose makes sense to some extent. If you can't offer the full experience of on-campus education, is the program still as valuable, and should you charge the same price? Well, apparently, let's say less than 10% of the universities that we have been able to investigate, let's say, are of the opinion that they need to change their tuition fee. What do we see in the interest of students on our portals and the data that we collect? Since the outbreak of COVID, which is basically the vertical line on week 10 on this graph, we saw a huge drop of traffic on our portals for every level: bachelor's, master's, PhD, short courses. But very quickly, more or less since week 13, so 3 weeks into the outbreak here in Europe, let's say, so this is all after China, we see a steady recovery for most levels so far, getting close to the share of traffic that we saw last year, because what this basically gives you is the comparison to last year. Short courses is still suffering quite a bit overall, but other than that, the others are slowly picking up. Online versus on campus, we saw a huge drop for the interest in on campus and a huge spike in the interest for online. It seems that by now the interest for on campus is gradually going back to normal, if that is a term we can still use these days, and online is still way up 25% from last year, but down from the spike of close to 60%, so 50 something percent around week 16, 17. So I'm quite convinced that online is here to stay. The question is, what is the how do you say, the balance between the interest for on campus and online? How is that going to pan out in the end? Now, specifically looking at the business and management discipline, I think there's been developments going on over the last 3-4 years already, where we see the interest for, let's say, less traditional subject areas in business and management really coming up quite a bit, such as supply chain management and business intelligence and analytics, which are not so, let's say, traditional and relatively new. If we look at master's programs on campus, when we look at masters online, then we see that the MBA is still popular, as is business administration overall, and that the new areas tend to be more in entrepreneurship and innovation management, which basically have a very good market opportunity where there's clearly undersupply and a huge over demand. At the undergraduate level, popular subject areas, international business simply continues to be very popular and have a good market opportunity. Same goes for management, organization and leadership and business administration. The subject areas that have basically quite a negative market opportunity, so oversupply, under demand, finance, marketing, accounting, and again, supply chain management and logistics is the one of the subject areas with the best opportunity. So in terms of overall, let's say, risk mitigation, there is scope for online, there is more scope for new subject areas, and I suppose more opportunities to also differentiate your product offer as business schools between bachelors and masters. That is briefly my introduction. I'll stop sharing and then hand over to Matthias again for the rest of the webinar.
Thank you, Thijs. That was very informative. We got a couple of questions in concerning your demographics here, Thijs. Can you quickly say a little bit about where do you get those numbers from? What are the respondents? Where do they come from, etc.?
For the survey, we basically send it out in, by now, batches, weekly batches, let's say. The report that we're basically about to publish, but that doesn't take into account the latest numbers yet. We had about 10,000 recipients with the initial batch of about 1,000 respondents, and they come from all over the world. If you look at the overall nationality breakdown, we do get, of course, a lot of students coming out of, yeah, I'm not sure if developing countries is still the politically correct term, but a lot of them coming out of Asia and Africa. Certainly India and Nigeria, to name two main countries, Kenya, Cameroon. Yeah, the split bachelor master, I mean, overall in our registrants database, yeah, the vast majority of students are the ones looking for a master's program. I don't know the gender split by now, nor the age split. I mean, we have it in the report. As I said, it will be released later this week. So keep an eye out for LinkedIn or the studyportals.com website to download the report. And then yeah, everybody can see that.
Great. Thank you. I think particular questions that probably would be best to be answered by both by Sanjeev and Andrew. Where do you see the trends going to? We all see the online becoming the dominant way of teaching. Is this going to last? And if so, how do you change the reality? And you specifically at Thunderbird, but what do you see in the larger North American context? And you, Andrew, how do you see the trends going? What do you see from business schools today? And what is your forecast? What do you think will be the reality in 2021 and further down the road?
Andrew, you want to go first? You'll probably talk about the big picture. I could talk about Thunderbird,
okay.
and, sort of our experience.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks very much. Very, very interesting presentation, and great to be engaging with so many online. First thing I'd just say is that, you know, I've seen a lot of surveys in the last few weeks from third parties, from consultants and so on. And there's clearly some common themes which were very well identified just now. I think there's a lot of need for scrutiny interpretation of the data sets around the surveys, because what's clear to me is that there's very different geographical and sectoral markets and opinions, if you like. You know, those who are currently considering studying as opposed to those who are kind of perhaps mulling it in the longer term. Students from China, very distinctive in their characteristics, I think, from those from India or from Nigeria, for example. And so sometimes, I'm not saying in this case, but sometimes one sees some quite high-level comments about, you know, huge scale of deferring, for instance. But then when you drill down and you see where the countries are that respondents are coming from, it perhaps belies the underlying picture that's relevant for particular business schools, for example. So there's that nuance, but it's clear that I think overall COVID has driven an acceleration of a lot of underlying trends that we've already been seeing in business education in the last few years, and that were brought out, I think, very well just now in these trends. So obviously the shift to online in the short term, some degree of appetite for deferral, but I think as the data there showed, actually very significant numbers still currently planning at least to go ahead with their studies, even if that means potentially disruption or difficulties in so much face-to-face. And that may speak partly to the fact that, of course, in the economic downturn, the kind of the parallel impact, if you like, that'll be far greater than the direct health impact of COVID, we are going to see a great deal of uncertainty in the world of work. And in many ways, that provides a good opportunity, or at least the best that might be available for people to replug, reflect, reskill if they have those opportunities. What does it mean longer term? I think, you know, Sanjeev can speak obviously from his frontline experience, but I think very few faculty can yet confidently predict, one, what the market will be like, and two, therefore, how exactly to respond in the months ahead. I think very few would want to go permanently only online, where they've been used to a largely face-to-face experience. But I think blended provision will be very much part of the future, starting from the current term and building on the kind of ad hoc measures for adjustment that we've seen. And I think, as again the survey data highlighted, there's clearly going to be some balance about the value equation, whether more students will want more shorter modular training, whether there's a growing appetite perhaps for undergrad business skills rather than a full-time 1 year or 2 year, much more expensive master's course, what the fee levels could realistically be in a different set of experiences. Let me stop there.
Great.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Matthias and Thies. That was, you know, again, as Andrew said, there's many studies out and a lot of surveys, but that data was very powerful and very consistent, as Andrew was saying. I want to thank Nicole also for her organizing of this great Globinar. For us, as Andrew knows, at the Thunderbird School, you know, we had already begun a quite dramatic transformation of our programs. And so going into even COVID, we had already had, if you think about our 4 areas, undergraduate immersive, undergraduate online, graduate immersive, graduate equal across the board in terms of our student intake. I think that put us in a very strong place to be able to seize and pivot as soon as COVID hit. But I do want to add a second really important thing is that we have to be, and I think, you know, Andrew's last point about blended started to intimate this. There is really a continuum here that we're starting to all figure out in a much more systematic way. There's fully immersive, there's fully online, usually asynchronous with maybe a little, you know, primarily asynchronous. And the world of digitally synchronous enhanced learning is a new one, what we call at ASU Sync or Thun Sync. Now, that is a different world in a lot of different ways. The students themselves, and I see that my internet's a little unstable, so forgive me if you can't hear me, but the students themselves and their families still don't know how to consider the value and the quality of digitally synchronous online learning relative to immersive. So that's it's a new market segment. And so the consumers and, you know, the suppliers, us as educational institutions, are still trying to find that out. That includes the price point. What's the price point of that in between blended sets of propositions relative to a fully online asynchronous opportunity relative to a fully immersive one? In terms of recruiting, we right now, again, a lot of unknown unknowns as we spoke about in the pre-session, but we're looking at actually a 20 to 25% growth overall across our market overall in terms of student enrollment for fall next year, you know, 2020 relative to fall 2019, and skewed to a certain extent to the online, but not as dramatically as one might think. Secondly, not surprisingly, being in North America, the United States, and even more specifically, the challenge is really for not the desire to apply or enroll, but to actually matriculate, to come, right? Because of the visas, as Theis mentioned, right? And so what we've had to do is also adapt in every single way that was mentioned on that survey. Number one is to have different start times. So we now have 3 or 4 different start times: fall A, fall B, spring A, spring B. And each one a student can start depending on their individual needs, locations, aspirations. Number 2, they could start digitally synchronous, as I mentioned, enhanced. They can then convert into a face-to-face. They could start face-to-face and something happens with COVID, another wave, for example, or whatever, we can then revert back to that. And so there's a lot of flexibility that we as educators and as business schools and educational institutions have had to adapt to. That's one of the great things about being in a place like Arizona State University and Thunderbird, is that those digital assets were already available. The third and last point I make, at least in this round, is that we've also created pathways for students in terms of the classroom experience. So for example, we've committed at Thunderbird and ASU to go back face-to-face to the extent safety and health will permit as of fall, our North American fall, which is mid-August. Our expectation is that maybe half of the students, if we're lucky, a little bit more. We're 50-50, 50% international students, 50% domestic students. We predict about half the students will join us. We've created augmented classrooms where you have basically inbuilt microphones, inbuilt camera sets. The faculty member can be in the classroom with about half the students adequately socially distanced. The other half is engaging by Zoom, digitally enhanced. Everybody can see each other, everybody can hear each other. There can be breakout groups. And so you basically have an augmented classroom. And really, I'd say this is, the trends more generally. The MBA, as we know, was challenged. We chose to move to a Master's of Global Management. The idea really is the fourth industrial revolution, or Industry 4.0, the digital transformation, was already underway. It has accelerated because of COVID. It has certainly accelerated when it comes to educational institutions and business schools. So we have to practice what we teach. Even, I don't know if you all saw, our graduation ceremony was an avatar robot ceremony. So, the idea that we can somehow stay still is absolutely gone for sure, but the range of possibilities are much greater than right now. The market, we're in market formation stage right now. Back to you, Nadia.
Thank you, Sanjeev and Andrew. A question that came in here a couple of times asking, what about tuition fees? We know that most business schools are highly depending on the tuition fees and are creating revenues through their high tuition fees they charge. Where is it that you see the trend is going in relation to the tuition fees? What is that, what you can predict there?
So maybe I'll jump in just from our perspective. Right now, of course, as I mentioned, we have a range. The fees for fully immersive to fully online. What we haven't figured out, and I want to make this point again and really put a pin on it, we haven't figured out what the appropriate price point for a digitally enhanced synchronous experience is. That we haven't figured out. No one has figured it out, and that's what we're playing with. That's where the scholarshiping plays a big role. And we have assumed, and we have been delivering higher scholarships, certainly for incoming students and returning students, predicting that the fall semester will be largely digitally synchronous, particularly for our international students. And then going back to Andrew's point, when we're talking about India, as you saw the reports today, the greatest recession or economic crisis in last several decades in India, the willingness and the capability to pay is obviously changed in this particular moment. That might be an epiphenomenon. We don't know. It depends on what happens with the economy. Do we get a V? Do we get a U? What's happening in terms of the future? So we know that this is a very strategically important time to price effectively, and that's happening through scholarshiping. We have not altered our fundamental pricing structure at this point, but we will have to see, and particularly in that blended in-between space, what the pricing should be.
Andrew,
And
anything?
Yeah, I was going to say, first of all, I think the surprise or shock to many institutions has been the short-term adaptation for online, where they haven't, like ASU and others, been kind of long geared up for this. Is actually, it can be much more expensive to deliver online than in person, at least in the short term, with kind of new technologies, with retraining, adapting the platforms and so on. And also, of course, arguably a full learning experience, including blended online tools, can also have great value, arguably more than, dare I say it, largely a face-to-face classroom-based experience. There's all sorts of potential for shyer students to contribute more online, for more structured discussions and so on. But I think, of course, online learning doesn't just mean turning on the video at the back of a classroom. It's got to be shot differently, segmented, timed differently. You need a lot of faculty support, which might be done online, but will be one-on-one or small group alongside larger group sessions. So there's a completely different architecture and cost structure. That said, I think it's going to be hard to say to existing students, the majority of whom really value the idea of face-to-face as being an integral part of both their learning experience and the wider socialization and networking, to say that, you know, we will not receive that, but we'll still be paying the same amount as before. Now, I think medium to longer term, if institutions can genuinely prove that the value on the investment of paying is as great or greater. In other words, they're learning more, or they're being able to network in new and powerful ways that lead to better career outcomes. Then there can be a case perhaps for maintaining or even increasing fees in some new blended pedagogical model. But I suspect, you know, the longer term, the fundamental issue, and for example, ASU has been very articulate on this, is, you know, in the US and indeed elsewhere, affordability is a huge barrier to increasing the level of access to education, which is really what all of societies need to improve the levels and talents and expertises of their entire communities. And so between existing higher education institutions and the disruptors, we really do need to think about models that are much more accessible, flexible, and affordable. So I think your average price point over time really will need to go down. And whether that's through direct pricing, whether it's through subsidy, whether it's, you know, discounts off ticket prices and so on, or it's all sorts of segmented, modularized learning, really that's got to be the way forward.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. And I think you touched on something extremely important. There were a couple of questions coming in from participants here, particularly on shifting now the scope of that discussion here from the learning to all of the other activities that are happening off curricula around, and you mentioned that the networking, the career placement services, the alumni work, all of that will be very difficult to replace through an online module. And I said that in the beginning, we have schools like Wharton, for example, that charge 150K for an MBA, where of course prospect students say we will not be willing to pay the same amount on tuitions if we continue to do this online. So what is the response to that? How can we create either collectively a different set out there, or what is the change that could be made in the pricing?
Sanjeev, or
any of you? I'm sorry?
Yeah, I think we're already starting to see some very interesting experiences around virtual placements and mentoring, and around even virtual careers fairs, for example. So I think there's some interesting experiments, and of course around informal coffee chats, group socialization sessions. I think there's a segmentation by age and by personality type, if you like. I mean, as a reporter, I think there's never a substitute for going, meeting, observing, seeing people in their contexts, reading the full body language, engaging over a period in all sorts of different ways, formal and informal. Of course, there's a newer generation, and there are people in different parts of the world who are much more used to being, to basically conducting both their social lives and their professional activities online. And so arguably there's a easier adaptation. If you're in a multinational organization, of course, a lot of us have got used to all sorts of kind of online substitutes. So I think there are ways to explore. I still think that there's a huge value to face-to-face that'll be very difficult to replace. And I think, you know, the idea of sort of virtual study trips or virtual work placements, there's still an awful long way to go to really deliver the same sort of value.
So here I'm going to disagree with Andrew. Oh, go ahead, Tisa.
I think there's a lot you can do online, but there's only so much you can do online. I think in the end, a lot of the face-to-face, whether it is the networking, the career service, the internship, what have you. I mean, a lot of that you simply can't replace by online. And whether you translate that automatically into, therefore you have to lower your fees, I mean, that's ultimately, of course, a different kind of discussion, but a very legitimate question from students, that they say, well, I mean, I'm happy to pay, whether that's 60K or 100K tuition fee for a program on campus, which offers me this, that, and the other. But if they can't offer me all of that or some of that, is it still, am I still willing to pay? And what can you do? I mean, I think I was just talking to a colleague of mine at Studyportals the other day, who's doing an MBA at RSM in Rotterdam, and the way she put it to me, so I mean, I can only take her word for it, let's say, was that one of the USPs was the classroom interaction, the group work, the networking, what have you. That she feels is basically being chopped off, so it's not the same program.
So, I'm gonna then respectfully disagree with Andrew and Tisa and say we are never gonna go back to an immersive world of the way we had, and in fact that there's gonna be tremendous disruptive innovation over the next 2 to 3 years. And again, our clients, the students and their families, are gonna adapt to the new realities and see the value of it. Now think about it pre-COVID even, and which will be the same post-COVID. You basically had 3 types of students. I'm simplifying grossly, but 3 types of students. And it depends, again, on Andrew's right about this in terms of their age and professional experience. But the 3 are, I do it because of the experience. I want to engage, I want to be in activities, I want to, make friends, I want to have, particularly for a school like Thunderbird, the international experience, being with lots of people from around the world. On the other end of the continuum, I'm doing this because of the ROI. I want a job with a higher paying income, and that's the primary and the predominant reason that I'm doing this as a student or as their family members, their parents. And then there's the blended students. We in education institutions, we would love to have lots of students on the first end with, they want the experience. It's so great. They love this experience. That's why they think that we're so special. But in fact, what we've seen, at least we've seen in our data, that we've looked pretty systematically, and Andrew, I've talked to you a lot about this, and Tisa, welcome your thoughts, but is that the ROI side has grown dramatically in a big, big way. And so if, in fact, this is where we don't have yet, if, in fact, digitally synchronous and or digitally asynchronous online can have a greater ROI, lower cost, higher return, then we're going to see many, 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 many more. And if we as educators create more compelling, valuable experiences in that way, the better, the more you're going to see that migration over. Now, will there always be a subset that wants to do in person? Absolutely. But I do think that the blended area is going to grow dramatically. And I think it's going to grow. If I could just add the last 2 points, it's going to grow dramatically, particularly at the more senior level. So undergraduates, certainly of certain types. But the last point I want to make is the point that you made, Andrew, is access. For most of our low-income students around the world, online will become the primary avenue to a reasonably good experience, and that's up to us to make it better and better as educators, and to the access, inclusion, and then opportunity for an ROI, better jobs, better livelihoods. And so that market, I still think, is going to grow dramatically, and it behooves us to just do better in terms of the quality of the experience.
And I do agree that on the ROI, you're absolutely right. I mean, but at the same time, and before I wanted to interrupt you, you're doing that.
That's okay, that's okay.
You said undergraduate, I think that's a different group altogether. I mean, for undergraduate students, the experience of being abroad and it's a lot of it is much more around the lifestyle than, for instance, the ROI. So I think we also need to distinguish whether we're talking postgrad or undergrad, whether you're talking people in work or not. I mean,
but let's take undergraduate, Tees. You could imagine we're doing a bunch of international partnerships where they're doing they get 2 years now. The sort of one new model is they have 2 out of the 4 years. Let's say it's a 4-year undergraduate degree. 2 out of the 4 years is actually on campus. 1 year at our partner institution, let's say in Amsterdam, and 1 year with us physically. But the other 2 are online, are digitally enhanced. And so The price point can be different. The ROI, you could still get that in-person experience in 2 different cultures, 2 different environments. But do you need to stay all 4 years? Do you need to be there for that kind of time? That's the kind of thing that I think we're going to have to continue to
and I'm not
innovate in a major
discounting
way.
that. I mean, I do believe that it will be a disruptor, all of this, and there will be all kinds of innovations. That's not what I was necessarily arguing against. So yeah, let's move on, because I don't think we fully disagree.
No, I
fair
just,
enough.
I just add to that. I mean, Sanjeev, I agree with you. You know, there are clearly appetites and needs, as it were, for different types of experience. The only thing I wouldn't put all of the ROI into knowledge acquisition, let alone online knowledge acquisition. I mean, I think for a lot of people going to business school, you know, a lot of the ROI actually comes out not from knowledge directly, but from contacts and networks.
Right.
And that's going to be quite difficult still. I mean, I'd love to hear what, you know, you and other schools are thinking of to try to replicate those, you know, the less formal parts of learning and building those networks that you can call upon over time going forwards.
Yeah.
And I think incidentally, more generally, that's a challenge for business schools and higher education. It's thinking about how to build over time the cultivation of their alumni networks to feed back in and relate to current cohorts of students as well.
Good, thank you. We got a lot of questions in now that I try to cluster here a little bit. One is, and that's probably more towards Thijs, do you see any particular change now between MBA and specialized masters, business school masters?
I was afraid you were going to come back to me on that one. I'm having my team working on this as we speak, so I hope I'll have the answer, because this is really something I don't have readily available in a dashboard that I can see how that is panning out.
I can give some data from us, Matthias, because as Andrew knows,
yes,
in our MGM, our Masters of Global Management, we have 17 concentrations. Global business, the finance, marketing is one of them, but they can do a global entrepreneurship, global digital transformation, but they can do with our sister schools across ASU, sustainability, health solutions, global law, so forth and so on. In our first year, we saw about 50% global business and then 50% the other specializations. This has shifted now going into next year. Now that's one data point, it's only year over year, but basically it's shifted to only 25% doing the traditional global business sort of concentrations and 75% moving into global digital transformation or global entrepreneurship or sustainability. Not surprisingly, health solutions has gone way up because of what's happening with the pandemic. So just in terms of you know, a small case study, that's certainly what's happened with us. And we feel proud because we created those concentrations pre-COVID, and they now are bearing incredible fruit in terms of just the interest and growth year over year. Of course, it's only two data points, 2 years. We'll see what happens over the future.
Another question that came in also probably for you, Sanjeev, is coming from Tony Ogden, asking if you also have course level mobility so that students can take part of the program at ASU and part of it at another school. Is there more flexibility with COVID?
Absolutely. Well, even pre-COVID, right? You know, as Andrew rightly said, at ASU and Thunderbird, you know, we were on the digital frontier, and I think that's fair to say, but also on the multiple pathway frontier. So, you know, 1 plus 1s, 1.5.5s, 3 plus 1s for the undergrads, 2 plus 2s, 3 plus 1 plus 1s, every different, you know, pathway that you could imagine. We have international partnerships around that, right? And we're building, as you know, our sister school, University of Arizona, launched recently a very exciting, and I think they're doing good, but we think you know, we're certainly proud of, we're building a global university network with Sintana, you know, with a public-private partnership, which we think is going to create even more of these pathway programs. Going back to the point I made to Thijs, we're going to see, you know, these blended options, not just with a single university, but imagine now you get to go to 2 universities for part of your time, as well as to have the digital experience. So, you know, we have a lot of that happening. Absolutely.
Thank you, Sanjay. We have a lot of questions concerning rankings here also. Is there, we know that rankings do get a bit of criticism at this point that I've seen lately in press around what is the role of rankings, or what's the response of rankings into the current crisis. Is there anything that rankings could also do and support schools actually in the current phase they're in? That's probably more for Andrew, but also for Sanjeev. What do you think is a good approach
Andrew?
there, please?
Well, so first of all, I think rankings are, should be seen as part of a wider piece, certainly in terms of what we're providing in our editorial coverage, in attempts to collect data,
Absolutely.
and in attempts to sort of try and aggregate it. I think our experience, including in the very recent past, as we're continuing to collect information from both business schools and alumni, is that there's actually very strong appetite. There was an understandable kind of short-term concern from schools about the practicalities of collecting data, and about whether there would be any sensitivities from employers, recruiters, students, alumni in the short term, as they were kind of worried about COVID in responding. But I'm happy to say, actually, the feedback we've got and actually the responses we're getting suggests that all of those networks do actually value, and even more than perhaps in the past, we've had increased response rates actually in some of our data collection exercises. So that suggests to me, quite rightly, we were talking about return on investment earlier, when could be more essential than now, when businesses are looking to cut costs, including around training, when students and executives are thinking about whether to go back part-time or full-time to study, to really focus on differentiation and identify high quality training that is being provided by the business community. So I think our attempts at analysis and collection of data are really valuable and useful. As I say, we've been very sympathetic to the short-term issues. Certainly in the next rounds of data collection, we'll be both framing the outcomes, obviously in the context, the very specific concerns and pressures of COVID. We're also collecting some additional data, which we hope will provide insights to participating business schools about what students, alumni, recruiters, faculty, and others are doing, what they see as important courses, fees, appropriate ways to teach, and so on. So a lot of sympathy, but also a lot of value, and that's really what we're focusing on in the months ahead.
Good. Sanjeev.
If I could jump in, and I know that Tony was asking about course exchange alliances, reciprocal and combined enrollments. I'm sorry that if I wasn't being very clear. I see that as part of this whole sort of space of hybrid programs and educational opportunities where students can stack various different types of courses and experiences to create their degrees. I mean, that's where blockchain is going to be so important. So, and I'll come back to the question about rankings in 1 second. But for example, if we now, what we're working on is to get everyone's educational record on distributed ledger, so that wherever you take a course, there's a badge or so that you don't have to go to that last institution or 3 institutions back to show that you took X, Y, and Z, and it's all available, in a smart way and a safe and transparent and reliable way. So on the ranking side, I completely agree with Andrew. I think rankings, will be with us forever. It might be the bane of a dean's existence, to be totally honest, but they will be with us forever. What I hope that we will continue to do, and I think that, Andrew and the FT and some others are really doing this, is adding additional or categories and or types of questions. So for example, we've talked about, previously, Andrew, about sustainability and ESG and so forth. We see that majorly upticking again because of COVID. Well, whether that's going to sustain over. I think the other part though is this, can we get the rankings to really look at adaptability, flexibility, customization for the customers, which are the students, for different price points. I think that is, inclusion as much as ROI, because all of these things are now new criteria that I'd like to see the rankings take into more consideration. If I could just say, Matthias, the one thing that I feel like we haven't touched base, and I think it's implicit in a lot of the questions, what are employers looking for? We spend a lot of time thinking, if we think about the ROI side, we're talking, as I know Andrew is and Tees is and you are, to the employers. And let me just give you a window from executive education, which was the hardest hit segment for us and for virtually every business school, right? Because companies shut down, there's no more international travel, there's no face-to-face. For us at Thunderbird, everything 80% of what we do is deliver internationally around the world. So it was a huge early indicator, a leading indicator of the impact of the crisis. We started talking with our companies and chief learning officers that, hey, we can do this really great, very high value, digitally synchronous executive education. You have your staff remotely working. Most of them, frankly, don't know how to work and manage in virtual teams, build trust, all these kinds of things. I'll just give you one example. I won't name the company, one of our largest clients. They start off by saying, absolutely no, we will not do any digital. We're just not interested. We're not gonna cancel on you. We're gonna postpone. The world will come back and we'll start again. By about the third week or fourth week, they came back and said, could you do some short courses, master classes, webinars on managing virtual teams, on sort of pain points that they were feeling, and do it digitally? We said, of course we could do that. Now that same client, very large corporation, I might add, is doing 90% of its exec ed digitally synchronous with us. So I think that we're going to see a similar kind of pattern with students and their families as they adapt to the new realities, and we get better as educational institutions at providing value in this world. Employers are looking for students, graduates that actually can work in this quasi-virtual world that we're always going to have.
Right. Thank you, Sanjeev. We have 10 more minutes, and there is a question that comes from the audience here that is also clear to us, that many of you come from business schools, work in business schools that are struggling right now because they are in COVID red zones, particularly schools, let's say in cities like New York, for example, NYU Stern. We have Bocconi here in the audience from Milan, i.e. Madrid. So all top schools, as we know, but all currently not necessarily in what we would call a safe destination country or a safe destination city. So that has been becoming a very, very common term. And I think, Thijs, you have been writing also around this, and also you, Andrew. What can we, in this changing market reality that's driven by a completely new and something that we're probably going to explore further in the future, new political and economic paradigms. So how can those schools that have recruited top quality students in the past, how can they contemplate, how can they balance while keeping that location? How can they still get the top school students to come to their campuses?
Well, from my perspective, and obviously I'm sure the others will want to chip in, but I mean, I think first of all there's the trade-offs between physical safety, security around health threats, and obviously that's something we may all have to live with in successive waves in the coming months or years. But I think the perceptions perhaps are a little bit different also based on the age groups and the nature of where people are based. I've certainly heard anecdotally in East Asia, in China, there's a lot of concern about the physical safety of their students, their children, studying in Europe and the US, for example, at the moment. But I suspect that will ease over time. I think one response is to make the distinction between the, should we say, the on-campus experience, which could involve phases of being more or less in quarantine, but physically on campus, social distancing during some sort of face-to-face experiences, seminars or classrooms and so on, combined with online teaching, perhaps arguably just as challenging, particularly in these big urban campuses, is the off-campus experience and how willing students are, or kind of the authorities feel they need to get involved in limiting social distance in, students going off to parties or restaurants and so on. I think that could be a much more difficult challenge. The second thing, I think, is thinking about not only the online blending, but the idea of blending regionally. Sanjeev was talking about his Amsterdam partnerships. I think a number of other business schools either have or are exploring relationships relationships with regional institutions. So it could be that, for example, if Asia, if India, if China is in a period of low infectivity, that students even studying at a US business school could actually spend a semester in a regional campus where the situation might be safer at that period, and then would have a physical option
Absolutely.
to shift to another part of the world or to the main campus as the health situation improves. So I think that's going to be very much part of the equation going forwards.
I think, I mean, as part of all the international marketing and recruitment for students, I mean, destination marketing comes into play at every location, let's say. And I think in this, yeah, what is added to the mix, if you like, is indeed what Andrew was referring to, this idea of safety. I mean, there's already in the tourism sector, there's already a competition going now. Who's opening his borders for tourists from which countries? Who can travel where? Where is it safer to go? Whether all that information is yeah, comparing apples and apples or apples and oranges is another thing, but a lot of it is, of course, perception, and that is always at play, whether it was pre-corona or post-corona. And yeah, destination, I mean, yeah, Milan in itself is an attraction value compared to, let's say, yeah, maybe my hometown where I'm here and nobody has ever heard of, but it does have a university. So that in itself is not necessarily going to change, I think. But the question is, how are you communicating that in your PR material? And I think that aspect of communication is going to be yeah, just as vital. And either you get it right or you don't. And as such, attracting the talent, that game hasn't changed. I mean, it's going to be more competitive, I think, but every university has, let's say, its own definition of what a talented student is for them, and that will not change. I mean, whether it's online, offline, blended. So ultimately,
and
I think.
Thijs, I'm sorry to come in. We talk a lot about student mobility, recruitment. What about the other internationalization aspects that we know in higher education, student exchange, faculty collaborations? This has been asked by Tammy Gorfi, the president of ESCA Casablanca, who just raised that point. Where is it that we're going to head with a larger scope of internationalization that goes beyond student recruitment, which is a substantial part of business schools' identity today?
Well, I think, I mean, and I think Sanjeev has already alluded to that. I mean, they're continuing to do all kinds of things that might replace the, let's say, on-campus face-to-face experience, but still offers an international flavor. And that could be international classrooms online. I forgot the definition of COIL, but that's basically the whole idea of collaborative online international. Yeah, that's it. Collaborative online international learning. I got it. The new vice president of EAIE explained it to me not so long ago at a conference that we both attended. I think that is an interesting aspect which brings, if you like, internationalization at home and online learning together. And I think that's an aspect that has been increasingly important and maybe will be even more increasingly important. You don't necessarily have to go abroad, of course, to have an international experience. So I think there is still going to be room for exchanges, whether they're online or physically, let's say. That's another one. And if physically, maybe shorter exchanges, which was also a trend that was already there. You don't necessarily have to go for a full semester or a full year. Why not go for a couple of weeks and then indeed go to a destination that is presumably, let's say, safer than another destination that you would normally have picked, let's say. So I think, yes, things will change, but at the same time, I don't believe that I mean, once the vaccine is there, of course, things may go back to normal, so to speak, as well. So I don't think we're looking at the end of the world as we know it necessarily. The question is, what do we do in the interim period now? And then I think a lot of things have already been suggested by either Andrew and Sanjeev and me, let's say. Yeah.
Yes, I'm very unfortunate to say that we are coming to a close of this webinar. I would like to give also Andrew and Sanjeev a chance to have some concluding words. Thank you, Thijs. And please.
Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah,
Andrew.
no, well, I mean, great to have this sort of discussion and engagement. Really interesting to hear some of the questions and concerns and ideas. As I say, I mean, the FT takes these issues very seriously. We continue to refine, as Sanjeev was saying, the issues of sustainability and social impact, for example, alongside the more traditional skill sets of business schools remain a very important editorial focus and is something we're increasingly trying to reflect in our rankings and our reporting. And so very much look forward to further engagement. I think it's a hugely difficult and challenging time for the sector, but nonetheless, I think COVID is accelerating a lot of forces that were underway already and pushing some innovation that could actually deliver a better set of outcomes for a wider range of people.
So thank you so much, Matthias and Nicole, Thijs and Andrew. It is, for me, we're in the front lines, and so to be able to step back and think about, what we're trying to do in real time, I think I'd just end with sort of 3 really quick points. Our principles are health and safety first. Obviously, that's going to now become an increasing marker of where students go, where families send their students, particularly our younger students. Number 2 has been creating as educationally rich experience as possible for the new world that we have now entered and that has accelerated. And that means all of these hybrid new models, digitally enhanced, multiple pathways, partnerships, so forth and so on. I will say on the co-curricular, extracurricular side, we've created an online app platform called T-Bird Connect, Thunderbird Connect, where all of our alumni are connecting with our students in real time in affinity groups and so forth and so on to not only mirror, but accentuate what they might have gotten in person. So I think there's a lot. And the third is innovation, therefore. How do we continue to push ourselves to embrace the digital world, the 4th industrial revolution, so that we can provide our students with not only like the rich experience, but also the experience that's going to be ROI with the greatest possible inclusion and access. So thank you so much. This has been great for me.
Thank you. So then I would like to conclude with that. It was a great webinar. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Andrew, Sanjeev, and Thijs. And I think probably most of you also read the recent interview. It was a GBSN interview with Peter Tufano, the Dean of Said Oxford Business School, where he said this crisis has everything to create real change in the future. And I think our industry, the business school industry, is very much in the epicenter of that. And I think to end it with a good note here, I'm looking forward to see the changes and to be part of this. And so I think I would like to thank very much GBSN for hosting us, for co-sponsoring this webinar, also Studyportals and XOLAS. I think it has been a great cooperation. I look forward to the next webinar that we're going to produce in the very future. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good afternoon and evening.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon or a good day.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.